Leslie Wells, Connection Coach here. We are here for another soccer sesh because it's soccer season and this is the only time that I really have. So today I want to talk about the anxious preoccupied with the dismissive avoidant and how that dynamic works out. Oh, and I help individuals work on earning secure attachment so they can show up better for themselves and so they can show up better in their relationships. People who do not work with their attachment style and try to earn secure attachment typically do not experience really healthy, secure relationships, and they're not able to show up in their best ways as their best self or really show up for their partner. So there's usually issues within your committed relationships. Okay, so a little bit about the anxious preoccupied. The needs of the anxious preoccupied are really their biggest fear and their core wounds are I'm not enough and I do not want to be alone. So they're really terrified of rejection and abandonment. They do not want to be alone. And they were brought up on intermittent reinforcement where they were never really sure when they would get their needs met or feel love, security, safety, and nurturing from their caregivers. So whenever they did not get those things and their caregiver was unable to show up well for them, whether they weren't physically available or they had a substance abuse issue or they were an alcoholic or maybe they had a mental health issue, whenever they could not show up well, they would get extreme anxiety because they didn't know when they were going to get their needs met again. And then when that person was able to show up well for them, then they would feel really, really good. And this created intermittent reinforcement where they sort of got a high from whenever they could get their needs met and then had extreme anxiety when they couldn't. So they grow up being the people that are really people pleasers. They are hop from one relationship to another because they desperately do not want to be alone. They need lots and lots of reassurance, and sort of their identity is built on their relationships. And so they really need to know that their relationship is solid and secure and need lots and lots of reassurance. They can be a little clingy and they have a list of needs that seems to be never ending. So the dismissive avoidant is quite the opposite. They did not receive emotional attunement as a child, so they did not learn to process their feelings. They think feelings are strange when they're on display. They were criticized, judged, corrected, got in trouble, or dismissed or ignored whenever they brought up their feelings. So they grew up thinking that they were defective whenever they would want to express their feelings, and so they learned to distract and suppress them, and they pretty much learned to deal with things on their own. Nobody was there to really nurture them through emotional things, and so they learned to do that on their own. They spent a lot of time on their own. They became hyper independent because they very much had to deal with things internally on their own because nobody was there to help them through those things. And so they learned that the safest place for them to be, so they weren't criticized or judged or felt bad or defective when they did have feelings, was on their own. Their safest place was to retreat by themselves. So they grow up to be people who typically spend a lot of time with hobbies, with other friends, time alone, but they don't like to get enmeshed in a relationship. They're very afraid of losing their independence and their autonomy, and they really, really value their space and independence. They also hate conflict. Both of these attachment styles hate conflict. The anxious preoccupied hates conflict because they don't want to do anything that is going to sabotage the relationship, because that means that they could potentially be rejected and abandoned and left without that relationship. So the anxious preoccupied will people please. They will fawn if there's conflict. They will do anything they can to get back that connection because it is so painful for them to not have that connection and the fear of when they're going to be reconnected and if that's going to come back. For them, every fight feels like it could potentially be the end of a relationship. The dismissive avoidant just doesn't like conflict because they have no idea what to do with conflict. It was never modeled for them. They've never seen conflict. They do know that when somebody brings them conflict, it's going to be big emotions and feelings, and they don't know what to do with those. It's overwhelming for them, and they tend to shut down, disassociate, and withdraw. They also know that to be in a conflict, you're going to have to be vulnerable, and you're going to have to say things and express yourself, and that makes them super, super uncomfortable. So in the beginning, these two can actually show up kind of well together because it's not until the dismissive avoidant has the expectations of a true committed relationship. So it's having to navigate conflict, things that are real in a relationship, having to navigate conflict and expectations, and there actually being a label on the relationship, and then having to deal with vulnerability and transparency and all the things that go into a real relationship. Those are the things that trigger the wounds of the dismissive avoidant. So in the beginning, those things usually aren't present. So in the beginning, they're not pulling away, and they also really like accomplishment. So even though their parents weren't great at nurturing them emotionally and helping them process and identify and work through emotions, they sort of dropped the ball there. Even though they didn't really have any emotional intelligence, they did very much sometimes reward them on accomplishments and achievements. So that's something that they've learned to sort of make themselves feel good, and they'll get external validation from those things. So in the beginning of a relationship, when there's that pursuit part, when they're chasing a partner and they're pursuing them, that feels good to them when they have landed that relationship or they've started to sort of see progress in that way. So in the beginning, they show up very, very well. And even if they're coming on a little too strong in the beginning, the anxious preoccupied is going to eat that up because all they want is a connection and they don't want to be alone. So they'll look right over that red flag. So it's not until later in the relationship when conflict comes up that there's really a problem, because you have two people that are never going to address conflict. You have the anxious preoccupied. Whenever something is brought up, if they have a concern or they have a need and they bring it up and they get any sort of defensiveness or feelings that maybe the dismissive avoidant is shutting down, they're going to get scared. They're not going to want to ruin the relationship. So they're going to fawn, they're going to backpedal, and the conflict's never going to get resolved. For the dismissive avoidant, they're going to do the same thing. Dismissive avoidance, once there's a conflict, it triggers their inner defectiveness wound, the parts of them that feel broken, and so they shut down and withdraw. And they will then sweep that under the rug and just pray that enough time is going to go by where everybody's going to cool off and everything's going to be okay, and they're never going to bring it up again. Neither one of those two attachment styles is going to bring up a conflict again, which means nothing's ever going to get resolved. They're also never going to get to know one another. So the dismissive avoidant is not transparent. They're not vulnerable. They never really show who they are, because who they think they are is somebody who's defective and broken. So you're never really going to get to know the dismissive avoidant if you are too scared to ask questions and deal with having to have them have the capacity to build, to be able to have conversations with you. If you're afraid to show who you truly are because you feel like you're not enough, and you're afraid that's going to push your partner away, and the most important thing to you is a relationship, then you're not going to reveal who you are either. So neither one of those two attachment styles is probably going to be truly authentic and come with true vulnerability and transparency. Both of them are too afraid of being seen and rejected. The other big problem is the anxious preoccupied is going to really feel alone in this relationship. They're going to be clingy and needy and need lots of reassurance, and really want to spend all of their time with their partner because half of their identity is wrapped up in their partner. And that is going to make the dismissive avoidant feel completely smothered and trapped and withdraw and disassociate and pull away, because that has triggered all of their wounds, because they really value their autonomy and their space and their time alone apart from their partner, and they do not want their identity at all to get wrapped up in their partner. That is one of their big fears. So you can see how those two things would completely trigger one another and keep them stuck in a negative cycle. Because the DA is going to be so distant, it's really going to trigger that anxiety for the anxious preoccupied. And then once that person maybe has a little bit of time apart, or they pull back for a little bit and then the DA kind of comes back in, then they'll feel good again. So you can see how the dismissive avoidant really sort of puts them back into that really bad intermittent reinforcement that they experienced as a child. And that's extremely damaging for somebody. So there you have it. That's how the anxious preoccupied and the dismissive avoidant can trigger one another, and how their relationship dynamic can look if they do not do their work to earn secure attachment.